For almost 1,000 years, the Sith were gone. The Jedi believed the darkness had finally died with them. No Sith Lords, no Sith empires, no wars between light and dark, just silence. And then one day, a Jedi Master reached a terrifying conclusion. The galaxy might not even be real. Not the Republic, not the Jedi, not even the people living inside it. If everything was only an illusion, then nothing mattered. No laws, no morality, no mercy. And from that single thought, a new Sith was born. A Sith who would resurrect an extinct empire and ignite a war that would burn for 1,000 years. This is the story of Darth Ruin. At the time, no one in the galaxy knew that name. The Republic was living through what many believed was a stable age. Trade routes stretched safely between star systems, and the Jedi Order had returned to its traditional role as guardians of peace rather than soldiers of war. For generations, the Sith had not appeared. The old stories still existed, of course. Ancient records spoke of dark empires and terrible wars fought between Jedi and Sith thousands of years earlier. Entire worlds had burned during those conflicts. Civilizations had collapsed. Countless lives had been lost. But those wars belonged to history now. To most citizens of the Republic, the Sith were little more than legends from another era. Even many Jedi believed the same. Inside the quiet halls of the Jedi Temple, Sith teachings were studied only as warnings. Holocrons describing their philosophy were sealed away. She accessed only by senior masters who wished to understand the dangers of the dark side. The Sith were not expected to return, not after so many centuries of silence. Yet the Force itself rarely allows balance to remain undisturbed forever. Somewhere within the Jedi Order, there was a man whose thoughts had begun moving in a direction few others could understand. His name was Phannius. To the Jedi who knew him, Phannius was not a warrior defined by combat. He was something else entirely. A thinker, a philosopher of the Force, a Jedi who spent more time questioning the nature of existence than mastering the techniques of battle. Many within the Order admired his intelligence. Some even respected his unusual perspective on the Force. But others quietly worried about him, because Phannius asked questions that most Jedi avoided. Questions about the nature of reality. Questions about whether the galaxy truly existed the way people believed it did. And slowly, over time, those questions began leading him somewhere dangerous. Phannius had started to believe something unsettling, something that would eventually destroy everything he had once sworn to protect. He began to believe that only one thing in the entire universe was truly real: his own mind. If that idea was true, then everything else, the Republic, the Jedi, the people of the galaxy, could simply be illusions. And if the galaxy itself might not even be real, then nothing that happened inside it truly mattered. Not life, not death, not suffering. It was a thought so cold and so absolute that it would soon reshape the destiny of the Sith forever. Phannius did not arrive at this belief suddenly. It came slowly, like a quiet change in the current of the Force. For many years, he had been considered one of the most thoughtful minds within the Jedi Order. While other Jedi trained endlessly with lightsabers or studied the history of the Republic, Phannius spent long hours in meditation chambers and temple archives. He studied the Force not as a weapon, but as a mystery. To most Jedi, the Force was simple in its purpose. It was the living energy that connected all things. It guided the Jedi toward balance, compassion, and selflessness. But Phannius believed the Force raised deeper questions, questions about existence itself. During long meditations, he began to examine the nature of perception, how beings experienced reality, how thoughts shaped understanding, how the mind interpreted the universe around it. At first, these reflections seemed harmless, even admirable. The Jedi had always encouraged study and contemplation, but Fannius began taking those ideas further than anyone before him. If the Force connected all living things, how could anyone truly prove that those things existed outside their own awareness? Every sight, every sound, every sensation was filtered through the mind. Everything a person knew about the galaxy came through their own perception, which meant something unsettling. The galaxy might only exist because the mind believed it did. Fannius spoke about these ideas carefully at first, quiet conversations with fellow Jedi scholars, private debates within temple libraries, calm discussions about the nature of consciousness and perception. Some Jedi listened with curiosity, others grew uncomfortable, because the more Fannius explored these ideas, the further his conclusions drifted away from Jedi teachings. If the universe could not be proven real, then moral responsibility itself became uncertain. Why sacrifice for others if those others might only be illusions? Why obey the Jedi code if the galaxy it protected might simply be a dream? The Jedi believed in service, compassion, and humility. Fannius began to believe in something else: absolute will. If the mind was the only thing that could be proven real, then the only truth that mattered was the power of that mind, and the Force could make that power limitless. At first, the Jedi Council simply watched him. Fannius had not broken any rules. He had not shown anger or aggression. He had not embraced the dark side openly. But there was a change in him. The calm humility expected of a Jedi Master slowly faded. In its place came a quiet certainty. Fannius began speaking less about balance and more about control, less about compassion and more about freedom. Freedom from the illusions of morality. Freedom from the restraints of the Jedi Code. Some masters began to sense something dangerous growing within him. Not hatred, not rage, something colder, a belief that the galaxy itself was meaningless. Because if life was only an illusion, then suffering was an illusion as well. And if suffering was not real, then nothing prevented a person from causing it. Fannius never raised his voice. He never threatened anyone. His tone remained calm and thoughtful. But the ideas behind his words began leaving a quiet unease among those who heard them. It was as if a Jedi Master was slowly stepping away from the very foundation of the Order. One day, a senior master finally asked him a simple question. If the galaxy is only an illusion, then what purpose does the Jedi Order serve? Fannius thought about the question for a long moment. Then he gave an answer that no Jedi in the room would ever forget. Perhaps, he said softly, the Jedi exist only because my mind imagined them. It was the first moment when some members of the council truly understood what they were facing. Fannius was no longer simply questioning reality. He was placing himself above it. And once a mind begins believing that nothing else truly exists, there are very few limits left to break. Not long after that conversation, something inside the Jedi Order quietly changed. And masters began watching Fannius more carefully, not because he had done something wrong, but because they could feel where his path might lead. And in the Force, the path ahead of him had already begun to darken, a darkness that would soon lead him to abandon the Jedi forever. The change did not happen overnight. For many within the Jedi Temple, Fannius still appeared the same as he always had. He walked the quiet halls with the same calm posture. He spoke with the same controlled voice. To younger Jedi, he remained a respected master whose wisdom seemed almost endless. But those who knew him best could sense the distance growing. Phineas no longer spoke of the Force the way other Jedi did. Where they saw harmony, he saw uncertainty. Where they saw balance, he saw limitation. The Jedi Code had always taught restraint. There is no emotion. There is peace. There is no ignorance. There is knowledge. There is no passion. There is serenity. To the Jedi, these words were a guide toward clarity. To Phineas, they began to feel like chains. If the galaxy itself might be nothing more than perception, then why should a person restrain their will for the sake of others? Why surrender power in service to a reality that might not even exist? These questions slowly separated him from the Order. Conversations with fellow masters became shorter. Meditation sessions grew longer and more isolated. Phineas spent increasing amounts of time studying ancient texts, not only Jedi teachings, but records of forbidden philosophies and dark side history preserved within restricted archives. He searched for answers the Jedi Code could not provide, and with each passing year, the distance between Phineas and the Order widened. Some masters quietly suggested that he should be guided back toward traditional Jedi teachings. Others believed his thoughts were simply the result of intense philosophical study, but none of them fully understood how far his mind had already traveled. Phineas had reached a conclusion that could not coexist with the Jedi Order. If reality itself was uncertain, then the Jedi Code had no authority. One evening, without warning, Phineas requested a private audience with the Jedi Council. The meeting was quiet. No raised voices, no accusations. Phineas spoke calmly, explaining that his studies had led him to a different understanding of the Force, one that could no longer exist within the boundaries of the Jedi Order. He did not attack their beliefs. He simply no longer shared them. The council listened carefully. Some masters hoped the conversation might guide him back toward the light. Others already sensed that the decision had been made long before he entered the chamber. In the end, Phineas offered no argument. He simply bowed his head and told the council that he would be leaving the Order. No trial followed. No exile was declared, because Phineas had broken no rule. A Jedi could leave the Order if they chose. It was rare, but it was not forbidden. And so, the man who had once been one of the most respected minds in the Jedi Temple walked away. Quietly, without anger, without regret. The halls of the temple remained silent as he departed, the sound of his footsteps fading into the evening. No one stopped him. No one followed. Yet many Jedi felt an unease they could not explain. It was not simply the loss of a Jedi Master. Something deeper had shifted. Phineas had not left because he was defeated. He had left because he believed the Jedi were wrong. And somewhere beyond the reach of the Republic, the path he was about to follow would lead him toward knowledge the Jedi had feared for thousands of years. Knowledge that would soon transform the former Jedi Master into something the galaxy had not seen in centuries, a Sith Lord. Beyond the borders of the Republic, the galaxy became quiet. The great hyperspace lanes grew thin and uncertain. Trade routes faded into unexplored regions where maps ended and silence began. It was here, far from the watchful eyes of the Jedi, that Phineas continued his search for answers. He had not left the Order out of anger. He had left because he believed the Jedi had misunderstood the Force itself. For centuries, the Jedi had taught restraint, balance, selflessness. They believed the Force guided life toward harmony, and that the duty of a Jedi was to protect that harmony. But Phineas had reached a different conclusion. If the galaxy might only exist within perception, then the Force was not something that guided life. It was something that could be controlled, and control meant power. In forgotten corners of the galaxy, Phineas began searching for knowledge the Jedi had hidden away long ago. Ancient ruins, lost holocrons, fragments of history buried beneath centuries of fear and silence. All of them pointed toward the same forbidden truth: the Sith. Long before the Republic had spread across the stars, the Sith had ruled vast empires through the power of the dark side. Their philosophy rejected the Jedi belief in balance. Instead, the Sith embraced ambition, dominance, and absolute freedom. Power was not something to restrain. Power was something to seize. The Jedi had destroyed those empires long ago, believing they had ended the Sith forever. But the knowledge of the Sith had never completely vanished. It had simply been forgotten. Phineas found those forgotten teachings, and the more he studied them, the more clearly he began to see something the Jedi had refused to accept. The Sith had not been wrong. They had simply been defeated. The dark side offered something the Jedi would never allow: unlimited will, the ability to bend the Force toward personal desire rather than surrendering to its balance, to shape reality instead of obeying it, to a mind like Phineas. The idea felt inevitable. If the universe was uncertain, then the only true meaning came from the strength of one's own will, and the dark side rewarded will above all else. Years passed as he studied these teachings, slowly reshaping his understanding of the Force. Meditation became something different now. No longer peaceful reflection, but a confrontation with the deepest instincts of the mind: ambition, control, dominance. Phineas did not fear these emotions the way the Jedi had taught. He embraced them. Through the dark side, he began to see the galaxy differently, not as a fragile balance of life that needed protection, but as something that could be shaped by those strong enough to command it. The transformation was not sudden. It happened slowly, as the man who had once been a Jedi Master allowed the darkness to become part of him. Eventually, even the name Phineas began to feel distant, a name tied to a life that no longer existed. The Sith had always taken new names when they embraced the dark side, names that reflected their power and the destiny they intended to create. Phineas chose one that felt appropriate, a name that carried the promise of destruction, a name the galaxy would soon learn to fear: Darth Ruin. For centuries, the Sith had been nothing more than history. But now a new Dark Lord had risen, and unlike the ancient Sith empires of the past, Darth Ruin did not intend to rule alone. He intended to rebuild the Sith themselves, one follower at a time, one fallen Jedi at a time. Until the darkness returned to the galaxy in numbers the Jedi could never stop. The Sith were not extinct. They had only been waiting, and now their new master had arrived. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant had always been a place of quiet discipline. Its vast halls echoed softly with the footsteps of young Padawans moving between lessons. Meditation chambers remained filled with calm stillness, broken only by the slow rhythm of breathing Jedi who sought clarity within the Force. For most within the Order, life followed a familiar path: training, study, service to the Republic. The Force guided them, and the Jedi Code kept their minds balanced. For thousands of years, this rhythm had remained unchanged. But among the many masters who lived within the temple, there was one whose path had always been different. Phineas was never known for his skill with a lightsaber. He was known for his mind. While other Jedi Masters studied the Force through combat forms or diplomatic missions across the Republic. Phineas preferred something quieter. He spent long hours inside the archives, reading ancient records that most Jedi rarely touched. History fascinated him, not simply the events themselves, but the ideas behind them, the rise and fall of civilizations, the beliefs that shaped entire cultures, the philosophies that guided Jedi and Sith throughout thousands of years. Phineas studied all of it. To many within the Order, his curiosity seemed admirable. The Jedi had always valued knowledge, and Phineas possessed a rare ability to examine difficult ideas without becoming emotionally attached to them. At least, that was how it appeared. In truth, Phineas was searching for something. He had spent years meditating on the nature of the Force, trying to understand why the Jedi viewed it the way they did. The Order believed the Force created balance in the galaxy. Light and dark were meant to exist in harmony, and the Jedi were responsible for protecting that balance. But the more Phineas examined these teachings, the more uncertain he became, because the Force did not always behave the way the Jedi described. He had seen war. He had seen suffering on distant worlds while the Force remained silent. He had seen individuals rise to power, not through balance, but through will. These observations planted a quiet doubt in his mind. Perhaps the Jedi did not fully understand the Force. Perhaps the galaxy itself was far more complicated than the Order believed. These were not dangerous thoughts at first. Many Jedi questioned their understanding of the Force during their studies. The Order encouraged reflection and careful examination of difficult ideas. But Phineas was not satisfied with simple answers. The deeper he explored these questions, the more he began focusing on something unusual. Not the Force itself, but the way beings experienced reality. Every Jedi perceived the galaxy through their own senses: sight, sound, memory, emotion. All of it passed through the mind before becoming understanding, which meant something strange. Everything anyone knew about the galaxy existed inside their perception. A starship passing through hyperspace, a city rising above the clouds of Coruscant, the Force itself flowing through living beings. All of it was experienced through the mind. And if every experience passed through the mind first, then how could anyone prove the galaxy existed outside it? The thought arrived quietly during meditation. At first, it seemed like a simple, philosophical question. But once Phineas began exploring it, he could not let it go. What if the galaxy itself was only something the mind perceived? What if reality existed only because consciousness believed it did? Phineas did not share this thought openly at first. Instead, he returned again and again to the archives, studying ancient texts about perception, the nature of consciousness, and the deeper mysteries of the Force. Each piece of knowledge pushed the idea further. Every being understood the galaxy differently. Every mind interpreted reality in its own way, which meant the galaxy might not be as solid and certain as people believed. Eventually, Phineas began speaking about these ideas with other Jedi scholars. She most treated the discussion as an interesting debate, but some masters noticed something troubling. Phineas was not exploring the question as a possibility. He was beginning to believe it. The idea that reality might be uncertain slowly became the center of his thinking. And once that idea took hold, the rest of the galaxy began to look different. The Republic, the Jedi Order, even the lives of other beings. If all of them existed only within perception, then their importance might be far smaller than anyone realized. And that quiet thought would soon grow into something far more dangerous. At first, the thought seemed harmless. Phineas treated it like any other question explored through meditation. The Jedi had always believed that understanding the Force required patience, reflection, and the willingness to examine ideas from every angle. But this idea refused to remain a simple question. It followed him everywhere. During meditation, it returned. During quiet walks through the temple gardens, it returned. Even when listening to other masters speak about the Force, the thought lingered quietly in the back of his mind. What if the galaxy only existed through perception? Phineas began examining the idea carefully, step by step, as he had done with every other philosophical study, every experience a person had passed through the mind. Sight, sound, memory, emotion. Even the Force itself was something a Jedi perceived and interpreted through their own awareness. Two Jedi could stand in the same place, feel the same presence within the Force, and still describe the experience differently, which meant their understanding of reality depended entirely on their own perception. Phineas found this deeply unsettling. The Jedi believed the Force connected all living beings and revealed the true nature of the galaxy. But if perception shaped reality, then even the Force might only exist within the mind. At first, Phineas tried to dismiss the idea. It contradicted everything the Jedi Order believed. The code taught that the Force revealed truth. It guided the Jedi toward balance and harmony with the galaxy. Yet the more Phineas studied perception, the harder it became to ignore the possibility that reality itself might not be as certain as the Jedi claimed. Meditation became different for him after that. Instead of seeking calm within the Force, he began observing his own awareness, watching thoughts appear and disappear, watching sensations form within the mind. Every experience seemed to arise from perception. The galaxy outside and the mind within began to feel strangely connected. Eventually, the question changed. It was no longer whether perception shaped reality. It became something far more extreme. What if the mind was the only thing that truly existed? If every experience was filtered through consciousness, then the galaxy itself might simply be an image created within the mind. Planets, people, the Republic, even the Jedi Order. All of it could exist only because the mind believed it did. The thought was quiet, but powerful, and once it appeared, it began changing the way Phineas saw everything around him. If the galaxy might not be real, then its rules might not matter. Morality, duty, sacrifice, all the values the Jedi protected were built upon the assumption that other lives were real and worthy of protection. But if those lives were only perceptions, then their suffering might not truly exist. Phineas never spoke this conclusion aloud. Not yet. But the idea slowly reshaped his understanding of the Force. The Jedi believed the Force guided them toward balance and compassion. But if the universe itself might be uncertain, then perhaps the Force was not guiding anything at all. Perhaps the Force was simply a tool, a power waiting to be used by whoever possessed the will to control it. This was the moment when Phineas began drifting away from the teachings of the Jedi, not through anger, not through hatred, through certainty. He was beginning to believe that the galaxy itself might only be a creation of his own awareness. And if that belief was true, then there was only one thing in the universe that truly mattered: his will. The idea was dangerous in a way the Jedi Code could never allow, because once someone believes that nothing else is real, there are very few limits left to obey. The first signs were subtle. No alarms sounded within the Jedi Temple. No warnings echoed through the halls. To most who lived and trained there, Master Phineas still appeared calm and composed, just as he always had. But the Jedi were trained to sense disturbances long before they became visible. And slowly, some masters began to feel that something about Phineas had changed. It was not anger, it was not fear. Those emotions were easy to recognize. What they sensed instead was something colder. Distance. During council discussions, Phineas spoke less about the balance of the Force and more about its nature. When young knights described their missions across the Republic, he rarely commented on justice or compassion. Instead, he asked questions that seemed strangely detached from the lives being discussed. Questions about perception, questions about awareness, questions about whether beings truly understood the reality they believed they were protecting. At first, the conversations seemed harmless. The Jedi Order had always welcomed thoughtful debate. Many great masters throughout history had questioned the nature of the Force, and philosophical discussions were not unusual within the temple. But Phineas did not treat these ideas as possibilities. He spoke about them as if he had already reached the answer. During one quiet gathering in the archives, a fellow master once asked him what he believed the purpose of the Jedi truly was. Phineas paused before answering. "The Jedi believe they serve the galaxy," he said calmly. The other master nodded. "That is our duty." Phineas studied the ancient texts resting on the table between them. But what if the galaxy we serve is only something our minds have imagined? The room fell silent. At first, the other Jedi believed he was speaking metaphorically. Philosophers often used unusual language when describing the deeper mysteries of the Force. But Phineas did not smile. He did not soften the thought. He simply continued. Everything we experience passes through the mind. Every planet, every life, every moment of the Force. If all of it exists within perception, how can we prove that anything outside our own awareness truly exists? The question was unsettling, not because it was impossible to ask, but because of the certainty behind it. The Jedi Code was built upon responsibility to others. Protecting life required believing that life had meaning beyond one's own existence. Phineas was beginning to question that foundation itself. The conversation ended quietly that evening, but the unease remained. In the days that followed, several masters began discussing Phineas privately. They spoke about the direction his thinking was taking. Some believed he was simply exploring difficult philosophical territory. Others feared that his ideas were drifting towards something the Jedi had long warned against. Not the dark side itself, but the mindset that often led to it. The dark side of the Force did not always begin with anger or hatred. Sometimes it began with detachment, a belief that other lives mattered less than one's own will. Phineas had not shown violence. He had not acted against the Jedi. But his thinking was beginning to move toward a dangerous place. If reality itself could be questioned, then the suffering of others could also be dismissed. And if suffering no longer mattered, then the restraints of the Jedi Code would slowly lose their meaning. The Council watched him more carefully after that, not as an enemy, but as a Jedi walking closer to a path that had destroyed many others before him. A path that often began with curiosity, but rarely ended with peace. The change inside Phineas did not appear as anger. There were no sudden outbursts, no violent confrontations. To anyone who did not listen carefully to his words, he still looked like the same calm Jedi Master who had spent years studying within the temple. But the ideas guiding his thoughts had begun moving far beyond the limits of the Jedi Code. For generations, the Jedi had believed that balance in the Force came from humility. A Jedi was meant to serve life, not control it. Power was never meant to belong to the individual. It belonged to the Force. Phineas no longer saw it that way. If the galaxy itself might only exist within perception, then the Force could not be something sacred guiding reality. It would simply be another part of that perception, another tool shaped by the mind. And if the mind was the only thing that could truly be proven to exist, then the only power that truly mattered was the will of that mind. This belief slowly reshaped the way Phineas viewed everything the Jedi stood for. The Jedi Code asked its followers to surrender personal desire in service to balance. But to Phineas, surrender now seemed unnecessary. Why surrender power to something that might not even be real? The idea felt liberating. For the first time in his life, Phineas began to imagine a different relationship with the Force. Not one built on restraint, but on freedom. Freedom to shape the Force according to his own purpose. Freedom to act without being bound by rules created by others. The Jedi believed that emotions such as ambition, pride, and desire led to darkness. Phineas began to see those emotions differently. Ambition meant growth. Desire meant purpose. Will meant control. The Jedi feared these instincts because they believed they would lead to suffering. But if suffering itself might be nothing more than perception, then perhaps those fears had always been illusions. Phineas did not embrace the dark side in a sudden moment of rebellion. Instead, his thinking simply moved further away from the foundation of the Order. He began studying forbidden records within the archives more carefully, ancient texts describing the rise of the Sith during earlier eras of galactic history, accounts of dark side teachings preserved only for study and caution. The Jedi viewed these teachings as warnings. Phineas began viewing them as possibilities. The Sith had once ruled vast empires through the dark side of the Force. They rejected the idea of balance and instead embraced personal power as the highest truth. The Jedi had always believed the Sith were destroyed because their philosophy was flawed, but Phineas began to see something different. Perhaps the Sith had not been wrong. Perhaps they had simply been defeated. If the universe existed only within perception, then victory, not morality, determined which philosophy survived. This thought slowly hardened into certainty. The Jedi Code was not the ultimate truth. It was simply one interpretation of the Force, and Phineas had begun discovering another. By the time the Jedi Council realized how far his thinking had moved from their teachings, the decision had already been made. Phineas no longer believed the Jedi understood the Force, and soon he would leave the Order behind completely, not in anger, not in hatred, but with the calm certainty that his path was leading somewhere the Jedi would never allow him to go. Toward knowledge the Order had feared for centuries, toward the teachings of the Sith, and toward the name that would one day echo across the galaxy, Darth Ruin. The decision did not arrive with anger. There was no moment of rage inside the Jedi Temple, no broken lightsabers, no desperate argument before the Council. For Phineas, the choice had already been made long before anyone else realized it. His mind had traveled too far from the teachings of the Jedi. Inside the quiet meditation chambers of the temple, he had spent years examining the nature of the Force, the nature of reality, and the strange connection between perception and existence. At first, those studies had simply raised questions. Now they had become answers. Phineas no longer believed the Jedi understood the Force. To the Order, the Force was a guide, a living energy that connected all beings and demanded balance between light and dark. The Jedi served that balance by protecting life and restraining their own power. But Phineas had begun to see something different. If reality itself might only exist through perception, then the Force could not be an authority above the mind. It would simply be another part of perception, another phenomenon experienced by consciousness. And if the mind was the only thing that could truly be proven to exist, then the will of that mind mattered more than anything else. These ideas slowly separated him from the order that had raised him. The Jedi believed in humility. Phineas now believed in certainty. The Jedi believed power should be restrained. Phineas believed power existed to be used. This difference was too large to ignore. For a long time, he continued living inside the temple as if nothing had changed. He attended council discussions, spoke calmly with other masters, and continued his studies within the archives. But the connection he once felt with the Order had quietly faded. The Jedi around him still believed they served the galaxy. Phineas was no longer sure the galaxy itself truly existed. Eventually, the distance became impossible to hide. One evening, Phineas requested a private audience with the Jedi Council. The chamber was quiet when he entered. 12 masters sat in a wide circle, their expressions calm, their presence steady within the Force. Many of them had known Phineas for decades. Some had trained beside him as knights. Others had watched him grow into one of the most thoughtful minds within the Order. They sensed no anger within him, only a strange calm. The conversation that followed was quiet. Phineas spoke about the path his studies had taken, about the conclusions he had reached regarding the Force and the nature of reality. He did not accuse the Jedi of being wrong. He simply explained that their teachings no longer aligned with his understanding. The council listened carefully. Several masters asked him questions, hoping to guide his thoughts back toward the principles of the Order. They reminded him of the responsibility the Jedi carried, the duty to protect life and preserve balance in the galaxy. Phineas listened respectfully, but his mind had already moved beyond those ideas. Finally, he spoke the words the council had begun to fear. He could no longer remain within the Jedi Order. There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, only certainty. The room fell silent. For a moment, the masters simply looked at him, she feeling the weight of what he had just said. The Jedi Code did not forbid a master from leaving the Order, but such departures were rare, and when they happened, they were remembered. Phineas bowed respectfully to the council. Then he turned and walked out of the chamber. No one tried to stop him, and in that quiet moment, the Jedi Order lost one of its most brilliant minds. But the galaxy had not yet begun to understand what it had gained. The council chamber remained silent long after Phineas left the room. For the Jedi Masters who sat within that quiet circle, the moment carried a strange weight. The Force around them felt unsettled, not through anger or violence, but through the quiet certainty of a choice that could no longer be undone. Phineas had not fallen to the dark side in the way the Jedi usually feared. Yet there had been no burst of rage, no violent act that forced the Order to intervene. Instead, he had simply walked away. And that made the situation far more difficult. The Jedi were guardians, not jailers. The Order did not imprison its members for their beliefs, nor did it force a Jedi to remain if they no longer accepted the code. For thousands of years, the Jedi had allowed their members to choose their path. It was one of the principles that separated them from the Sith, yet that freedom carried its own risks. The Council understood this better than anyone. Several masters spoke quietly after Phineas departed, discussing the strange direction his thinking had taken over the past years. They remembered the conversations within the archives, the philosophical debates about perception and reality, and the unsettling certainty that had begun to appear in his words. At first, Many of them had believed these ideas were simply intellectual curiosity, but now it was clear that Fannius had moved far beyond curiosity. His belief that reality itself might be uncertain had removed the foundation of the Jedi Code. If the galaxy could not be trusted to exist outside perception, then the Jedi duty to protect it lost its meaning. This was the danger the Council now faced. Fannius had not rejected the Force. He had redefined it. Instead of serving the Force, he had begun to see it as something that could be shaped by individual will. The Jedi understood where such thinking could lead. Throughout history, similar ideas had drawn many Force-sensitive beings toward the dark side. Jin the Sith had always believed that power existed to serve personal ambition rather than balance. The Council did not know whether Fannius would eventually follow that path, but they could feel the possibility within the Force. One master quietly suggested that perhaps Fannius should be watched, not hunted, not pursued, simply observed. The others agreed, because the truth was simple. They could not stop him. Fannius had left the Order peacefully, and the Jedi had no authority to force him back. The Republic had committed no crime. The Jedi Code itself did not forbid his departure. And yet, as the Masters reflected upon what had just happened, a quiet unease spread through the chamber. They had not just lost a Jedi. They had lost someone who possessed a mind capable of reshaping how the Force itself was understood. A mind that no longer believed the galaxy had meaning beyond his own awareness. That kind of belief could lead a person anywhere, to wisdom, or to something far darker. For the first time, several members of the Council began to wonder whether they had just witnessed the beginning of something dangerous. Something the Jedi might one day regret allowing to walk out of the temple. In the quiet years that followed, the Jedi Temple returned to its usual rhythm. Padawans continued their training beneath the watchful eyes of their masters. Jedi Knights departed on missions across the Republic, mediating disputes, protecting distant worlds, and preserving the fragile peace that had endured for generations. Life within the Order moved forward, but the Jedi did not forget. The departure of Fannius had become one of those rare moments that quietly settled into the memory of the temple itself. Not a tragedy, not a battle, but a decision that carried consequences no one could fully predict. Within the vast halls of the temple stood a chamber known to every Jedi, the Hall of the Lost. It was a solemn place, lined with statues carved from polished stone. Each statue represented a Jedi Master who had chosen to leave the Order during the long history of the Republic. The Jedi did not treat these figures as traitors. They were reminders, proof that even the wisest minds could one day choose a different path. Students were sometimes brought to this chamber during their training. Masters would explain that the Jedi Order valued freedom of choice above obedience. A Jedi could walk away if they no longer believed in the path of the Order, but that freedom came with uncertainty. No one knew what choices those former Jedi had made after leaving. Some had lived peaceful lives far from the Republic. Others had simply disappeared into the vastness of the galaxy. The statues did not tell those stories. They simply stood in silence. Years after Fannius left the Order, a new statue was added to that quiet hall. The figure stood calm and composed, carved in the traditional robes of a Jedi Master. His face was thoughtful, his posture relaxed, as if captured in the middle of quiet contemplation. At the base of the statue, a simple name was inscribed: Fannius. He became the 20th figure placed within that chamber. The first of what the Jedi would later call the Lost 20. For the Masters who placed the statue there, the meaning was clear. Fannius had not been defeated. He had not betrayed the Order through violence or corruption. He had simply walked away. And because of that, the Jedi chose to remember him not as an enemy, but as a warning. Students who visited the chamber often paused before his statue longer than the others. Perhaps it was because his story was still recent. Perhaps it was because the idea behind his departure was difficult to understand. A Jedi Master who no longer believed the galaxy itself could be trusted. To many within the Order, the idea felt strange and distant. But the Force does not always reveal the consequences of a choice immediately. The statue remained in the Hall of the Lost as a quiet symbol of a mind that had once belonged to the Jedi, a mind that had stepped away from the light without anger. And somewhere far beyond the Republic, that same mind was continuing its search for answers the Jedi had feared for centuries, answers that would soon lead to the rebirth of something the Order believed had vanished forever: the Sith. Beyond the bright skylines of Coruscant, the galaxy stretched into regions where the Republic's influence grew thin. The Jedi rarely traveled there unless duty required it. These were distant systems where ancient ruins remained buried beneath forgotten worlds, where the history of the galaxy had faded into silence long before the Republic expanded its reach. It was in those quiet regions that Phineas disappeared. No one within the Jedi Temple knew exactly where he went. The Council had considered sending watchers to follow him, but such actions would have contradicted the very principles the Order defended. Phineas had left by choice, and the Jedi had allowed that choice. So the temple remained silent while the former master vanished into the stars. For a time, it seemed as if the story might end there. Many Jedi believed Phineas would simply live the rest of his life as a wandering philosopher or scholar somewhere far from the responsibilities of the Order. There were many Force-sensitive individuals throughout the galaxy who had chosen such paths. But Phineas was not searching for peace. He was searching for knowledge. The ideas that had separated him from the Jedi had not faded after leaving the temple. If anything, they had grown stronger. Without the boundaries of the Jedi code surrounding him, for his studies could move in directions the Order would never allow. His travels slowly took him to places that carried the weight of older histories, ruined temples buried beneath jungle worlds, ancient archives hidden inside forgotten cities, fragments of civilizations that had once studied the Force in ways very different from the Jedi. Among these scattered traces of the past, Phineas began discovering something the Jedi had tried to bury: records of the Sith. Long before the Republic had reached its current strength, the Sith had ruled empires across vast regions of the galaxy. Their philosophy rejected the restraint of the Jedi and embraced personal power as the highest truth. The Jedi believed that arrogance and cruelty had eventually destroyed those empires. Phineas began seeing something else in their history. He saw determination. The Sith had refused to limit themselves. They believed the Force existed to be commanded, to a mind that had already begun questioning the meaning of reality itself. That belief felt strangely logical. If the galaxy might only exist through perception, then shaping it through will was the closest thing to truth that could exist. The teachings of the Sith did not frighten Phineas. They answered the questions the Jedi had avoided. Slowly, piece by piece, he began studying the dark side of the Force, not through anger, not through hatred, but through belief. Belief that the Force was not something to serve, it was something to control. And through that belief, the final transformation began. The Jedi Master, who had once walked calmly through the halls of the temple, no longer existed in the same way. The mind that had once questioned reality was now shaping it according to its own will. The galaxy would soon learn the name that replaced Phineas: a name that carried the promise of destruction. Darth Ruin. And with that name, something the Jedi believed had vanished forever quietly returned to the galaxy. The Sith were rising again. Far from the bright towers of Coruscant, the galaxy felt older. The Republic still existed, of course. Its fleets still traveled the great hyperspace routes, and its laws still guided thousands of systems. But beyond those familiar lanes, the stars grew quieter. Out there, the history of the galaxy did not feel finished. It felt buried. Ancient civilizations had once risen and fallen long before the Republic expanded across the stars. Their temples had collapsed into ruins. Their cities had turned into forgotten stone beneath thick jungles and desert sands. Most travelers ignored those worlds, but Phineas was searching for them. He moved slowly through the outer rim and beyond, following scattered fragments of history preserved in old star charts and half-forgotten records. These were places where knowledge, older than the Republic, still slept beneath the surface. Places the Jedi rarely visited. The further he traveled from the Republic, the more the galaxy seemed to change. The presence of the Jedi faded from the Force. On distant worlds, the light side felt weaker, thinner, as if it had never fully taken root there. Instead, the Force carried older echoes of conflict, echoes of power that had once shaped entire civilizations. Phineas followed those echoes patiently. His search eventually led him to ruins left behind by cultures that had studied the Force long before the Jedi Order became dominant. These places held fragments of ancient teachings, carved into stone walls or preserved inside forgotten holocrons. Many of the records spoke about a philosophy the Jedi had tried to erase. The Sith. Long before the Republic had reached its current strength, the Sith had ruled vast regions of the galaxy through mastery of the dark side of the Force. Their temples had once stood as symbols of absolute power, where the will of a single Dark Lord shaped entire systems. The Jedi had eventually destroyed those empires, or at least they believed they had. Phineas walked through the broken remains of those forgotten temples, studying every symbol and every surviving record. What he discovered did not frighten him. Instead, it confirmed something he had already begun to believe. The Sith had not misunderstood the Force. They had simply approached it differently. The Jedi believed the Force demanded humility and balance. The Sith believed the Force rewarded strength. To the Jedi, power was something to restrain. To the Sith, power was something to claim. Standing among those ruins, Phineas began seeing the Force through a new perspective. If reality itself might only exist through perception, then shaping that reality through will was the closest thing to truth a being could achieve. The Sith had understood that. Their philosophy had not been about balance. It had been about control. The Jedi feared the dark side because it encouraged ambition and desire. But ambition and desire were simply expressions of will. And will was the one thing Phineas believed could not be denied. For the first time since leaving the Jedi Order, his thoughts felt aligned with something larger than himself. Not the Jedi, not the Republic, something older, the dark side of the Force. Phineas began studying the ancient teachings carefully, and learning the rituals and meditations used by the Sith Lords who had once ruled those forgotten empires. The knowledge was dangerous, but it was also clear. The dark side did not ask its followers to surrender their desires. It asked them to embrace them. And with each passing day among the ruins of the Sith, Phineas moved further away from the man who had once been a Jedi Master. The ruins did not teach quickly. The knowledge Phineas had discovered was ancient, scattered across fragments of temples and broken holocrons. that had survived the fall of the Sith empires. Many of the records were incomplete, damaged by centuries of neglect or destroyed during the wars that had once consumed the galaxy. But the ideas within them remained clear. The Sith did not see the Force the way the Jedi did. To the Jedi, the Force was something sacred. It flowed through all living things and demanded respect. A Jedi learned to listen to it, to follow its guidance, and to protect the balance it created. The Sith believed something very different. The Force was not something to serve. It was something to command. Fania studied these teachings slowly, testing each idea through meditation and careful experimentation. He approached the dark side the same way he had once approached the Jedi teachings, through patience, discipline, and observation. But the experience felt very different. Where the Jedi encouraged calm and detachment, the Sith encouraged focus on desire. Emotion was not treated as a weakness. It was treated as fuel, anger, ambition, pride, determination. All of them strengthened a person's connection to the dark side. At first, Fanius approached these emotions carefully, as the Jedi Code had taught him to suppress them throughout his life. And abandoning that discipline did not happen instantly. But the more he studied the ancient Sith rituals, the more he began to understand their purpose. Emotion sharpened the will, and the dark side responded to will. During meditation, Fanius allowed himself to focus on ambition for the first time in his life. Not anger toward the Jedi, but something quieter. The belief that his understanding of the Force could surpass the limits the Order had imposed. The result was immediate. The Force responded differently than it ever had before. Where the light side had once felt calm and flowing, the dark side felt intense and focused. It did not guide him gently. It moved through him like pressure building beneath the surface of the mind. For many Jedi, that sensation would have been terrifying. To Fanius, it felt logical. If the Force could be shaped by will, then the dark side simply allowed that will to act freely. The ancient Sith texts described this transformation clearly. A Sith did not surrender to the Force. A Sith bent it. Through careful practice, Fanius began learning the techniques the Sith had once used to strengthen their connection to the dark side. Meditation rituals designed to focus emotion. Methods for drawing strength from ambition rather than suppressing it. Slowly, the way he experienced the Force began to change. The calm balance he had known as a Jedi faded into the background. In its place came something sharper, more direct, more powerful. Fanius did not feel corrupted. He felt awakened. For the first time, he believed he was understanding the Force without the restrictions imposed by the Jedi Code. But the transformation taking place inside him was deeper than simple knowledge. The dark side did not only change how someone used the Force, it changed how they saw the galaxy itself. Through the Sith teachings, Fanius began viewing life not as something fragile that required protection, but as something shaped by power. Those with the strength to command the Force would shape the future. Those without that strength would simply live within the world created by others. It was a philosophy built on dominance rather than balance. And slowly, without anger or regret, Fanius began accepting it. The transformation did not happen in a single moment. There was no sudden flash of power, no dramatic ritual where Fanius declared his loyalty to the dark side. The change was quieter than that. It happened slowly, one belief replacing another. For most of his life, Fanius had been guided by the discipline of the Jedi Order. The code had shaped every decision he made. Restraint, patience, humility. These were the principles that defined a Jedi. But now those principles were fading. Standing among the ancient ruins of the Sith, Phineas began to understand how deeply the Jedi Code had limited him. The Order had taught him to suppress ambition. The Sith teachings told him to embrace it. The Order had taught him that power must serve balance. The Sith believed power existed to shape reality itself. Phineas had spent years questioning whether the galaxy could truly be trusted to exist outside perception. The dark side offered a simple answer to that question. If reality was uncertain, then the only truth that mattered was the will strong enough to define it. The Sith had built their entire philosophy around that belief, and slowly, the man who had once been a Jedi Master began accepting it completely. His meditations changed. As a Jedi, he had once sought calm within the Force, allowing its energy to guide him gently toward balance. Now his focus was different. Instead of listening to the Force, he began directing it, pushing against it, bending it toward his intentions. The dark side responded with intensity. It did not resist ambition the way the Jedi teachings had warned. Instead, it strengthened it. Each time Phineas allowed his will to guide the Force, the connection grew stronger, more immediate, more powerful. The difference was undeniable. The Jedi had always feared that power. They believed it would eventually consume those who embraced it. But Phineas did not feel consumed. He felt liberated. For the first time, the Force did not feel like something he served. It felt like something he could command. The ruins around him became silent witnesses to that transformation. Ancient temples that had once belonged to Sith Lords now watched, as another mind followed the same path they had taken centuries earlier. The galaxy did not notice the moment when the change finally became complete. There was no audience, no ceremony, only a single figure standing alone beneath the broken stone arches of a forgotten Sith sanctuary. Phineas closed his eyes and reached into the Force one more time. But the presence he felt was no longer the calm balance he had once known as a Jedi. It was darker, sharper, alive with the strength of ambition and will. And in that moment, something within him quietly disappeared. The Jedi Master named Phineas no longer existed in the same way he once had. The beliefs that had defined him were gone. The man who had once walked through the halls of the Jedi Temple had become someone else entirely. Someone who believed the Force existed to obey his will. Someone who believed the galaxy itself could be shaped through power. The transformation was complete, but one final step still remained. A Sith did not keep the name they once carried. To embrace the dark side fully, a new identity was required, a name that reflected the path they had chosen and the destiny they intended to create. And names carried meaning among the Sith. They were not chosen lightly. When a follower of the dark side abandoned their old life, they also abandoned the name that belonged to it. The past was meant to be left behind, replaced by a title that reflected the power and purpose of the Sith who carried it. Phineas understood this. The name he had carried within the Jedi Order no longer described the person he had become. It belonged to another life, a life guided by restraint, by service, and by a belief in balance that he no longer shared. That life had ended quietly. What remained was something new. Standing within the broken sanctuary of the ancient Sith temple, Phineas allowed his thoughts to settle for a long moment. The dark side of the Force moved around him with a presence that felt stronger than ever before, not calm, not peaceful, but focused, responsive to his will. For years, the Jedi had taught him that such power would eventually lead to destruction. But destruction was not something Phineas feared. Destruction was simply change, old beliefs falling away, old systems collapsing. The Jedi Order believed they preserved balance in the galaxy. Phineas had come to believe they preserved limitation. The Sith had once understood something the Jedi refused to accept. Power shaped the galaxy. Those with the strength to command the Force defined the future. Those without that strength simply lived within the world created by others. Phineas no longer wished to live within someone else's reality. He intended to shape it himself. The name he chose reflected that intention. Ruin. Not ruin as chaos alone, but ruin as transformation. The collapse of old orders. The destruction of ideas that no longer deserved to exist. The galaxy itself had grown comfortable under the rule of the Republic and the watchful eyes of the Jedi. For centuries, they had believed the Sith were gone forever. Phineas knew that belief was wrong, and through him, the Sith would return. The name formed quietly in his mind, carrying the weight of the path he had chosen. Darth Ruin. The title of Darth had once belonged to the Dark Lords who ruled the ancient Sith empires. It was a name spoken with fear across entire systems. For centuries, that title had vanished from the galaxy. Now it existed once again. The former Jedi Master allowed the new name to settle within his thoughts. Darth Ruin. With that name, the final connection to his past disappeared. Phineas had been a philosopher within the Jedi Order. Darth Ruin would be something very different. The galaxy did not yet know that a Sith had risen again. The Jedi Council on Coruscant believed they had simply lost a troubled master who chose to leave the Order. But far beyond the Republic, among ruins older than the Republic itself, the dark side of the Force had already begun responding to its new master. The Sith were no longer extinct. Their return had begun quietly, with a single mind that refused to accept the limits of the Jedi. And soon, Darth Ruin would begin searching for others who shared that same belief. Because the Sith were never meant to remain alone. The galaxy did not notice the return of the Sith. Not at first. Across the Republic, trade routes remained busy. Starships moved between systems without fear. The Jedi Order continued its quiet work as guardians of peace, responding to small conflicts and protecting distant worlds from pirates and crime syndicates. Life moved forward, as it always had. For centuries, the Sith had existed only in old records and forgotten stories. Most beings in the Republic believed the ancient Dark Lords had vanished long ago, destroyed during wars that belonged to another age. Even the Jedi believed the same. But far beyond the borders of the Republic, something had already begun to change. Darth Ruin did not see himself as the last Sith. He saw himself as the beginning of something larger. The ancient Sith empires had fallen because they fought each other as often as they fought the Jedi. Their ambition had destroyed the unity they needed to survive. Ruin understood that history. If the Sith were to return, they could not rise as scattered warlords. They would need to rise as an order built on the dark side of the Force. And so, the new Dark Lord began searching. The galaxy was filled with individuals who felt the Force but had never been trained by the Jedi. Some had been discovered too late to enter the Order. Others had walked away from the temple the same way Phineas once had. There were also those who had fallen, Jedi Knights who had allowed anger or ambition to guide their actions, Padawans who had been expelled from the Order, Force-sensitive wanderers who had never belonged to the Jedi at all. The Jedi believed these individuals were rare. Darth Ruin knew otherwise. He found them slowly, moving through distant systems where the Republic rarely looked. Some he discovered through rumors of strange abilities. Others he sensed directly through the Force, flickers of power that had never been properly shaped. When he found them, he did not offer mercy. He offered understanding. Ruin spoke to them about the same truth he had discovered years earlier. The Jedi taught restraint because they feared power. The dark side existed for those willing to claim it. Some who heard these words rejected him immediately. They feared the darkness they sensed within his presence. Others listened longer. They were the ones who had always felt the limits placed upon them by the Jedi teachings, the ones who believed their strength had been restrained by rules they never fully accepted. To them, Darth Ruin offered something the Jedi never would: freedom. Not freedom from responsibility, freedom from limitation. The first of these followers became his apprentice. The identity of that first disciple has long been lost to history. Ancient records do not preserve the name clearly, and the chaos that followed would eventually erase many details from the beginning of Ruin's order. But the role that disciple played was undeniable. They became the first new Sith to rise under Darth Ruin, not the last. Over time, more followers gathered around the Dark Lord. Some were former Jedi. Some were Force-sensitive individuals who had never belonged to the Order. Others were simply beings drawn to the promise of power that the dark side offered. So each one was taught the same lesson. The Force was not something to serve. It was something to command. And with each new disciple who accepted that belief, the Sith moved one step closer to returning to the galaxy, quietly, patiently, multiplying in the shadows. The first disciple did not remain alone for long. Once the path had been opened, others began to follow. Darth Ruin did not build his order through conquest at the beginning. He understood something important about the galaxy. If the Sith revealed themselves too soon, the Jedi would respond with overwhelming force. The Order had defeated the Sith before. Ruin had no intention of repeating that mistake. Instead, he allowed the darkness to grow quietly. The galaxy was filled with individuals who felt the Force, but had never been guided by the Jedi. Some had lived their entire lives sensing strange abilities they could not explain. Others had once stood within the temple itself before being cast out or leaving by their own choice. Many of them carried the same feeling. They believed the Jedi had denied them something: power. Ruin found these individuals one by one, sometimes through rumors that traveled between distant worlds. Stories of a traveler who could influence minds without speaking, a wanderer who could sense danger before it arrived, a hermit who could move objects without touching them. Other times, Ruin sensed them directly. Through the Force, their presence appeared like small sparks scattered across the galaxy, untrained, unfocused, but filled with potential. When he found them, Ruin did not approach them as a conqueror. He approached them as a teacher. He spoke calmly about the nature of the Force, explaining the ideas he had discovered during his years of study. The Jedi believed power must be restrained in order to preserve balance. But the dark side offered something different. It allowed the will of the individual to shape the Force itself. Many who heard these words hesitated. The Jedi had spent centuries teaching the galaxy to fear the dark side. Stories of ancient Sith Lords described cruelty, destruction, and endless war. To follow such a path required abandoning everything the Republic believed was right. Some who met Ruin turned away, but others stayed. These were the individuals who had always questioned the limitations imposed by the Jedi. They were the ones who believed the Force should not be restricted by rules created thousands of years earlier. To them, a Ruin offered a new beginning. He began teaching them the same rituals and meditations he had learned within the ruins of the ancient Sith temples. Through these teachings, they learned to focus their ambition and their emotions instead of suppressing them. The results were immediate. The dark side responded quickly to those who embraced it. Their connection to the Force grew stronger, more intense than anything they had experienced before. But the transformation did more than strengthen their abilities. It changed how they saw the galaxy. Through the teachings of Darth Ruin, they began to understand the Sith philosophy. The Force did not belong to the Jedi. It belonged to anyone strong enough to command it. And slowly, across distant systems far beyond the attention of the Republic, a quiet movement began to grow. Small groups of dark side followers gathering in hidden places, studying ancient teachings, training beneath the guidance of a Dark Lord who believed the Sith were destined to return. The Jedi still believed the Sith were extinct, but in the shadows of the galaxy, their order was already being rebuilt, one disciple at a time. The gathering of dark side followers did not happen in one place. Darth Ruin understood that the galaxy was too vast for a single hidden temple to remain unnoticed for long. Instead of building a visible stronghold, he allowed his growing order to spread across many distant systems. Each disciple carried the teachings of the Sith wherever they traveled. Small circles of followers formed on forgotten worlds. Some trained within abandoned ruins, left behind by ancient civilizations. Others hid in remote colonies where the Republic rarely sent patrols. To the outside galaxy, nothing seemed unusual. But beneath that silence, a new order was slowly forming. Ruin did not see these followers as simple students. He saw them as the foundation of something greater. The Sith had once ruled empires through the authority of powerful Dark Lords. But those empires had eventually collapsed under the weight of their own rivalries. Sith masters had turned against each other, fighting for control instead of unity. Ruin intended to build something different, a brotherhood, not a single empire ruled by one Sith Lord, but an order of many Sith who shared the same belief about the Force. They trained in secrecy, learning the ancient techniques Ruin had uncovered during his travels through the ruins of the old Sith worlds. Through meditation and discipline, they strengthened their connection to the dark side. But their lessons extended beyond the Force. Ruin taught them about the failures of the past. He spoke about the ancient Sith empires that had destroyed themselves through endless internal conflict. He explained that if the Sith were to return successfully, they would need to avoid repeating those mistakes. Unity would give them strength. Numbers would give them power. For the first time in centuries, the Sith were not rising through a single Dark Lord and his apprentice. They were rising as an order. Each disciple who joined Ruin's teachings eventually took on the title that had once belonged to the ancient Sith Lords, Darth. With that title came a transformation. Their old identities were abandoned, replaced by new names chosen to reflect the power they believed they had claimed. The Jedi Order taught that identity should remain humble and connected to the past. The Sith believed the past should be destroyed. Each new Sith Lord represented another step in the rebirth of the Order. The Brotherhood grew steadily. What began as a small group of followers slowly became something far more dangerous. Sith disciples trained their own students. Those students eventually became Sith themselves. Within a generation, the number of dark side followers had multiplied far beyond what the Jedi could have imagined. The Sith were no longer a forgotten legend. They were becoming a hidden society. A brotherhood bound not by loyalty to the Republic or the Jedi, but by the belief that the Force existed to serve the strong. She and the galaxy still did not realize what was happening. The Jedi Council continued watching the Republic from their temple on Coruscant, unaware that the darkness they believed extinct had already begun to rebuild itself. Patiently, quietly, preparing for the moment when it would no longer need to remain hidden. The moment eventually arrived when the Sith could no longer remain hidden. For years, Darth Ruin had allowed his followers to grow in silence. Their training took place far beyond the reach of the Republic, and the Jedi Council continued believing the Sith had vanished from the galaxy forever. But secrecy was never meant to last forever. The Sith philosophy had always been built on power, and power demanded recognition. As the Brotherhood of Dark Side followers expanded, the influence of Ruin's teachings began reaching beyond the remote systems where his disciples trained. Some of the new Sith Lords began testing their abilities in the wider galaxy. At first, their actions were subtle. A Republic official suddenly found his mind bending to the will of an unseen visitor. Criminal syndicates on distant worlds began receiving guidance from mysterious figures who seemed able to predict the future. Small conflicts between planetary governments were quietly manipulated by individuals who understood how easily ambition could be turned against itself. None of these events seemed connected. To the Republic, they appeared as ordinary political disputes or criminal activity. But behind them stood followers of the dark side who had begun shaping events through the teachings of Darth Ruin. And each success strengthened their belief. The Force responded to their will, and the galaxy could be shaped by those strong enough to command it. Eventually, some of Ruin's disciples grew bolder. The first true conflicts began in distant regions of the Outer Rim, where Jedi presence was rare. Local rulers were overthrown through manipulation and fear. Entire systems fell under the influence of Sith Lords who had once been unknown wanderers. These victories were small compared to the ancient wars between Jedi and Sith, but they carried a powerful message. The Sith were no longer extinct. For the first time in centuries, whispers of their return began spreading across the galaxy. Republic scouts reported strange figures using powers the Jedi had once described in old historical records. These survivors of conflicts on remote worlds spoke about dark warriors who seemed to draw strength from anger and ambition. At first, these reports were dismissed. The Jedi had heard similar rumors before. But the whispers did not disappear. They multiplied. And slowly, a truth the Jedi had long refused to imagine began taking shape. Somewhere in the galaxy, a new Sith Order had risen. One not led by a single apprentice and master, but by an entire brotherhood of Dark Lords. At the center of that brotherhood stood the man who had begun it all, Darth Ruin. The Jedi Master who once questioned whether the galaxy itself was real had now created a force capable of reshaping it. The Sith had returned, and their numbers were growing. What the Republic did not yet understand was that this quiet rebirth would soon ignite one of the longest and most devastating conflicts in galactic history. A war that would not last years, or even generations. A war that would consume the galaxy for 1,000 years. The first world to fall did not send a warning. In the distant edges of the Outer Rim, small Republic outposts had always lived quiet lives. These were not wealthy systems filled with massive fleets or important political leaders. They were simple colonies, mining settlements, trade stations, and small planetary governments that rarely attracted the attention of the Jedi Order. For generations, these worlds had existed peacefully under the protection of the Republic, and because of that peace, they were unprepared for what was coming. The attack began without ceremony, no declaration of war, no message delivered to the Republic Senate, only silence. A mining colony on the edge of Republic territory suddenly lost contact with nearby systems. At first, officials assumed the problem was technical. Communications satellites often failed in remote regions of space, but when a patrol ship arrived to investigate, it found something far more disturbing. The colony was empty. Buildings still stood where they had always been. Cargo ships remained docked inside the small starport. Equipment and supplies were scattered exactly as they had been left, but the people were gone. Every resident. Not a single body was found. At first, the Republic believed pirates might be responsible. The Outer Rim had always struggled with criminal activity, and entire settlements had been raided before. But this felt different. There were no signs of battle, no damaged structures, only a strange feeling reported by the patrol crew, a presence in the Force that none of them could fully explain. The Republic quietly reported the incident to the Jedi Order. At the temple on Coruscant, the Council listened carefully to the details. Similar events had occurred occasionally in the past, and the galaxy was large enough that strange mysteries were not uncommon. But something about this report felt familiar. Too familiar. The Jedi sent a small group of knights to investigate the colony directly. When they arrived, the Force told them something immediately. The darkness had been here, not the quiet fear that sometimes followed criminal violence. Something deeper, something that carried the sharp presence of the dark side. The Jedi searched the abandoned colony carefully, examining the buildings and surrounding wilderness for any trace of what had happened. Eventually, they found one. Inside the ruined command center of the settlement, a message had been carved into the metal wall. The letters were deep and deliberate, cut into the surface with a blade. The Jedi recognized the language immediately. It was written in the ancient script of the Sith. For centuries, that language had appeared only in archived holocrons and ancient ruins. Now it stood before them again. The message was simple. The Sith live. The words echoed through the quiet halls of the abandoned colony. For a long moment, none of the Jedi spoke, because they all understood what the message meant. The Sith had not simply returned. They were announcing their presence. And somewhere in the galaxy, the one who had begun this return was already preparing something far larger than a single attack. News of the abandoned colony did not reach the public. The Republic Senate had faced many crises across its long history. She and the Jedi Order understood the danger of spreading fear without clear understanding. Reports from the Outer Rim were often incomplete, and the disappearance of a single settlement could easily be explained by piracy, local conflict, or natural disaster. But inside the Jedi Temple, the atmosphere had begun to change. The knights who had visited the ruined colony returned to Coruscant with a quiet certainty. None of them wished to speak aloud too quickly. They described the feeling they had sensed through the Force, the strange emptiness that surrounded the settlement, and the message carved into the metal wall. The Sith live. Those words carried the weight of ancient history. For centuries, the Jedi had studied the rise and fall of the Sith as a warning to future generations. They believed the ancient Dark Lords had been destroyed during wars fought thousands of years earlier. Since then, the dark side had appeared only in isolated individuals who eventually fell to corruption. But this felt different. The message had not been written by someone experimenting with forbidden knowledge. It had been written by someone who believed the Sith truly existed again. The Council listened carefully as the investigating Jedi described what they had seen. Some masters remained cautious. The galaxy was large, and the dark side often left confusing traces. It was possible that someone had simply discovered ancient Sith teachings and attempted to imitate their power. But others felt a deeper disturbance. The Force itself carried echoes of something awakening. In the days that followed, more reports began arriving from distant regions of the Republic. At first, they seemed unrelated. A trade convoy destroyed along a remote hyperspace route. A planetary governor suddenly overthrown by a group of mysterious warriors who seemed able to influence minds through the Force. A Jedi Knight stationed on an outer rim world who disappeared after sensing a powerful dark presence nearby. Each event alone might have seemed ordinary, but together they formed a pattern. The dark side was moving across the galaxy, quietly, deliberately. The Jedi Council began dispatching additional knights to investigate these disturbances. Some traveled alone, following faint traces of dark side activity across isolated systems. Others worked in small groups, hoping their combined awareness might reveal what was happening. What they discovered was troubling. More messages appeared on distant worlds, not always carved into metal walls like the first one. Sometimes they appeared as symbols burned into the ground, sometimes as fragments of ancient Sith language written across abandoned temples or destroyed outposts. But the message remained the same. The Sith live. The Republic still did not understand what these signs meant. But inside the Jedi Temple, a quiet realization was beginning to grow. The Sith had not returned as a single Dark Lord. They were spreading, and somewhere behind those scattered whispers, someone was guiding them. Someone who had already begun turning the dark side into something far larger than the Jedi had ever imagined. For a time, the Jedi believed they might still contain what was happening. Disturbances in the Force had appeared before in the long history of the Republic. Sometimes, a single fallen Jedi would gather followers, forming a small cult that the Order eventually dismantled. Other times, the dark side appeared through warlords or Force-sensitive tyrants who misused ancient teachings. The Jedi had faced such threats many times, but what they began to discover across the Outer Rim was something far more organized. Small teams of Jedi Knights sent to investigate the disturbances did not always return. At first, the Council believed they had simply lost contact with them. Communication failures were common in distant systems, where hyperspace signals traveled slowly through unstable regions of space. But eventually, fragments of information began reaching Coruscant. One knight reported encountering warriors who used the Force with unusual aggression. Their techniques did not resemble the calm discipline taught by the Jedi. They fought with emotion, with anger, and with a certainty that suggested they had been trained deliberately. Another Jedi described sensing several dark side presences working together in the same location. That alone was deeply unsettling. The Sith of ancient history had always operated in secrecy, hiding their numbers from the Jedi. But this time, the dark side was gathering openly. On a distant agricultural world in the Outer Rim, a small group of Jedi finally encountered the truth directly. They had arrived to investigate the sudden fall of the local planetary government. Reports described a group of powerful individuals who had overthrown the ruling council within a single night, replacing them with leaders loyal to an unknown order. The Jedi expected criminals. What they found instead were warriors cloaked in black robes. Each one carried a lightsaber, but the blades that ignited inside the ruined government complex were not the familiar colors of the Jedi Order. They burned red. The battle that followed was brief but brutal. The Jedi had trained their entire lives to defend the Republic, yet the warriors they faced fought with techniques that seemed strangely familiar. Their movements echoed the ancient forms of the Sith described in forgotten historical records. They did not fight like students. They fought like disciples. When the battle ended, The Jedi survivors recovered one piece of evidence that would finally remove any remaining doubt. A symbol. It had been carved into the armor worn by the dark side warriors, a design drawn from ancient Sith iconography that had not appeared in the galaxy for centuries. The Sith had returned, not as a rumor, not as a single fallen Jedi experimenting with forbidden teachings, as an order. When this report reached the Jedi Council, the chamber fell silent once again. For generations, the Order had believed the Sith were extinct. Now the truth stood before them. The Sith were alive. And there were far more of them than anyone had imagined. By the time the Jedi Council accepted the truth, the galaxy had already begun to burn. The Sith were no longer hiding. Across the Outer Rim, systems that had once been peaceful suddenly found themselves caught in violent upheaval. Planetary governments collapsed almost overnight. Trade routes that had remained stable for generations were cut off by mysterious fleets commanded by figures who wielded the Force with ruthless precision. The Republic struggled to understand what it was facing. At first, the Senate believed these events were isolated rebellions. Outer Rim territories had always been difficult to govern, and conflicts between local factions were common. But the pattern soon became impossible to ignore. Every world that fell shared the same sign: the presence of the dark side. Jedi Knights dispatched to defend those systems began encountering enemies unlike any they had faced in centuries. These warriors moved through the Force with aggression and confidence. She's striking with red-bladed lightsabers that had once belonged only to the ancient Sith Lords. More disturbing than their power was their number. The Jedi had expected to face a single Dark Lord. Instead, they encountered many. Each one carried the title that had once defined the rulers of the ancient Sith empires: Darth. The galaxy had not seen such a gathering of Sith in thousands of years. The realization struck the Jedi Council slowly, but once it did, the implications were impossible to ignore. This was not the return of a single enemy. It was the rebirth of an entire order. Behind it all stood the figure whose name had begun appearing in scattered intelligence reports across the Republic: Darth Ruin. The former Jedi Master had not simply embraced the dark side after leaving the temple. He had rebuilt the Sith themselves, gathering followers from across the galaxy and teaching them the philosophy that had once shaped the ancient Sith empires. What he had created was something the Jedi had never faced before: a brotherhood of Dark Lords. And now that brotherhood had begun spreading across the galaxy with terrifying speed. Republic fleets were dispatched to protect vulnerable systems, but military strength alone could not stop an enemy who could manipulate minds, predict movements through the Force, and inspire fear wherever they appeared. The Jedi were forced to become warriors once again. Knights who had spent their lives preserving peace suddenly found themselves standing on battlefields across distant worlds. Lightsabers ignited against enemies who understood the Force as well as they did, and who were not restrained by the same moral code. The conflict spread rapidly. Each victory, achieved by the Sith, encouraged more followers to join their ranks. Each fallen world created new opportunities for the dark side to expand its influence. The Republic had entered a war it did not fully understand, a war that had begun quietly with the transformation of a single Jedi Master. Now that war was consuming entire star systems, and the galaxy was only beginning to realize how long it would last. Because the conflict Darth Ruin had unleashed would not end in a single generation. It would stretch across centuries, 1,000 years of war between Jedi and Sith. At the beginning, the Brotherhood of Sith appeared unstoppable. Across the galaxy, their influence spread through fear, ambition, and the relentless will of the dark side. Worlds that had once trusted the Republic now found themselves ruled by figures who commanded the Force with terrifying certainty. Republic fleets struggled to contain the chaos, and the Jedi Order had been forced into a war it had never expected to fight again. To many outside observers, the Sith seemed united. They followed the teachings of Darth Ruin. They carried the same title once used by the ancient Dark Lords, and they fought with a shared belief that the Force existed to serve the strong. But beneath that appearance of unity, something dangerous had already begun to grow. The dark side did not reward cooperation. It rewarded dominance. Every Sith who followed Ruin had been taught the same lesson. Power was the ultimate truth. The Force responded to ambition, to desire, to the will of those who refused to accept limits. That philosophy had allowed the Sith to rise quickly, but it also carried a weakness that Darth Ruin could not easily control. Each Sith Lord believed in their own strength. Each believed their understanding of the Force might one day surpass the others. In the early years of the war, that ambition had been focused outward, directed toward the Republic and the Jedi. The Sith fought side by side against a common enemy, conquering worlds and spreading their influence across the Outer Rim. But ambition rarely remains satisfied for long. As the Sith Brotherhood grew larger, the number of powerful individuals within it began to increase. Some of Ruin's earliest disciples had trained their own followers. Those followers had eventually taken the title of Darth themselves, creating a growing hierarchy of dark side masters scattered across the galaxy. With every new Sith Lord, the balance within the Order shifted. Each victory strengthened the belief that power belonged to whoever could claim it. And slowly, the focus of that ambition began to change. At first, the signs were subtle. A Sith commander refusing to follow another Lord's orders during a campaign. Two Dark Lords competing for control of the same conquered world. Quiet arguments between disciples over who possessed the greater mastery of the dark side. None of these conflicts seemed large enough to threaten the Order itself. But the Force carried the truth beneath those events. The dark side did not encourage loyalty. It encouraged rivalry. Each Sith believed they deserved more power than the others. Each believed their vision for the future of the galaxy should be the one that prevailed. Darth Ruin had hoped his brotherhood could avoid the mistakes of the ancient Sith empires. But the philosophy he had used to build that brotherhood was already planting the seeds of its destruction. Because when every follower believes their will defines reality, eventually those wills begin to collide. And once that collision begins, the dark side rarely allows peace to return. At first, the conflicts remained hidden. The Sith still faced the Republic and the Jedi across dozens of battlefronts, and the war demanded their attention. Sith commanders led armies against Republic defenses, while Jedi Knights moved from system to system, trying to slow the expansion of the dark side. To the outside galaxy, the Sith still appeared united, but inside their own ranks, something had already begun to fracture. The dark side did not reward patience, it rewarded power. And among the growing brotherhood of Sith Lords, power quickly became the only measure that mattered. One of the earliest confrontations happened far from the central battle lines of the war. Two Sith Lords had been assigned control of neighboring systems that had recently fallen under the influence of Ruin's followers. Both believed they deserved greater authority. Both believed the other was unworthy of command. At first, their disagreement remained a quiet rivalry. They competed for influence over nearby worlds, and each trying to prove their superiority through conquest and manipulation. But the dark side rarely allows rivalry to remain quiet. Eventually, their conflict erupted into violence. When their followers clashed in orbit above a remote outer rim world, the battle that followed had nothing to do with the Republic or the Jedi. It was a struggle between Sith, each convinced that their power gave them the right to rule. By the time the conflict ended, one of the Sith Lords lay dead. The survivor claimed victory as proof that the dark side had chosen him as the stronger master. News of the confrontation spread quickly among the Brotherhood, but instead of condemning the act, many Sith accepted it as natural. The Sith philosophy had always taught that power determined authority. If one Sith could defeat another, then the victor deserved the right to claim their place. What began as a single duel soon became a pattern. Elsewhere in the galaxy, similar conflicts began to appear. Sith disciples challenged their own masters. Rival lords fought over control of conquered systems. Alliances formed and collapsed within weeks as ambition pushed each Sith toward greater authority. To the Jedi observing from the outside, the situation was deeply confusing. Reports began arriving that Sith forces were fighting each other even while the larger war continued. Entire campaigns stalled because Sith commanders refused to cooperate with rivals they believed inferior. The dark side that had once unified Ruin's followers was now driving them apart. Each Sith Lord believed their vision for the galaxy was the correct one. Each believed they possessed the strength necessary to dominate the others. Darth Ruin had hoped his brotherhood would avoid the self-destruction that had doomed the ancient Sith empires. But the same philosophy that gave the Sith their power also gave them their weakness. Because when every follower believes power belongs to the strongest, sooner or later, every follower begins trying to prove that they are the strongest. And when Sith begin fighting each other, the darkness they command rarely stops at a single battle. Darth Ruin had always known the danger. From the beginning, he understood the history of the Sith better than most of his followers. The ancient Sith empires had once ruled vast portions of the galaxy, yet every one of those empires eventually collapsed under the same pressure. Ambition. The dark side gave strength to those who embraced it, but it also filled them with a desire for greater power. No Sith was satisfied for long. Victory only created the hunger for more. Ruin believed he could guide that ambition. His brotherhood had been built on the idea that many Sith could exist within the same order without destroying each other. Instead of one master ruling over a single apprentice, Ruin allowed dozens of Sith Lords to rise under his teachings. At first, the idea had worked. The Sith had grown faster than the Jedi could track them. Their influence spread through hidden networks across the galaxy. Entire regions of space fell under the control of Sith commanders who acted in the name of the Brotherhood. But as the war expanded, the number of Sith grew with it. New disciples continued joining their ranks. Former Jedi who had fallen to the dark side found their way to Ruin's teachings. Force-sensitive individuals who had never belonged to the Jedi Order were trained in the same philosophy. Soon, the Sith Brotherhood contained more Dark Lords than the galaxy had seen in thousands of years. And with each new Lord came a new ambition. The conflict between Sith that had once been isolated incidents now began spreading across the Order itself. Rival factions emerged among Ruin's followers, each led by powerful Sith who believed they understood the dark side better than the others. Some still respected Ruin as the founder of the Brotherhood. Others began questioning whether his authority should remain absolute. After all, the Sith philosophy itself taught that power determined leadership. If another Sith proved stronger than Ruin, why should they not replace him? These questions did not remain theoretical for long. Entire Sith factions began competing for territory across the Outer Rim. Worlds conquered by the dark side became prizes fought over by rival Dark Lords who sought to expand their personal influence. The Brotherhood that had once spread through quiet unity was now breaking into separate camps. Some Sith followed Ruin directly. Others began gathering followers of their own, forming independent forces that answered only to their own ambitions. The Jedi and the Republic watched this chaos with cautious hope. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the Sith might destroy themselves before the war consumed the entire galaxy. But the truth was more complicated. Even while fighting each other, the Sith continued expanding their influence. Their conflicts did not weaken the dark side. They simply made it more unpredictable. Darth Ruin had created an army of Dark Lords powerful enough to challenge the Jedi. But he had also created something the galaxy had rarely seen before. A war not only between light and dark, but between the Sith themselves. The war against the Republic continued. Jedi Knights still fought across distant systems, trying to contain the spread of the dark side. Republic fleets still defended vulnerable worlds against Sith invasions. To the people living inside the Republic, the conflict seemed clear. Jedi and Republic on one side, Sith on the other. But the reality had grown far more complicated. Within the growing empire of the Sith, unity had already begun to fade. Darth Ruin had once believed that his Brotherhood could avoid the mistakes of the ancient Sith empires. By allowing many Dark Lords to exist together, he hoped the Sith could grow stronger than ever before. And in many ways, they had. The number of Sith now scattered across the galaxy was greater than anything the Jedi had faced in centuries. Their influence stretched across entire sectors of the Outer Rim. New disciples continued to rise under the teachings of the dark side. But the same philosophy that had allowed the Sith to grow had also created something Ruin could not fully control. Every Sith believed power belonged to the strongest. Every Sith believed their will should shape the galaxy. And when many individuals share that belief, unity becomes fragile. Rivalries continued spreading across the Brotherhood. Sith Lords competed for control of conquered systems, argued over strategy in the war against the Republic, and secretly gathered followers who answered only to them. Some of Ruin's earliest disciples began forming alliances with one another, hoping their combined strength would allow them to challenge rival factions within the Order. Others worked alone, trusting only their own power. The Sith had become something unpredictable. They still fought the Jedi. They still expanded their influence across the galaxy. But they were no longer a single force moving toward one goal. They were a storm made of countless ambitions, and storms rarely move in perfect unity. Darth Ruin remained the founder of the Brotherhood, but even his authority could not erase the nature of the dark side. The philosophy he had used to build the Sith demanded dominance, and dominance always led to conflict. Over time, that conflict would grow even more intense. The Jedi believed they were fighting an organized enemy. What they were actually facing was something far more dangerous. An order of Dark Lords who believed power alone determined the future. Some of them still followed Ruin. Others already believed they would one day surpass him. And somewhere within that growing chaos lay the truth the Sith themselves had always struggled to accept. The dark side could create power, but it could never create peace. The darkness always devoured itself in the end. The war had made Darth Ruin powerful. Across the galaxy, his name carried weight among the Sith who followed his teachings. Many of them had never known the ancient Sith empires described in forgotten histories. To them, the rebirth of the Sith had begun with one man. the former Jedi Master who had abandoned the Order and embraced the dark side, Darth Ruin. For years, the Brotherhood he created had expanded across the galaxy. New Sith Lords had risen under his guidance. Entire systems had fallen under their influence. The Republic and the Jedi now faced an enemy that had not existed for centuries. From a distance, it appeared as though Ruin had succeeded in building something the ancient Sith had never achieved. An order powerful enough to challenge the galaxy itself. But the dark side rarely allows power to remain stable. Within the growing ranks of the Sith, ambition continued spreading like fire through dry forests. Each Sith Lord carried the same belief that Ruin himself had once embraced. Power belonged to the strong. The Force responded to will. And if power determined authority, then no leader could remain unquestioned forever. Darth Ruin had always known this truth. From the beginning, he had studied the history of the ancient Sith carefully. Those empires had collapsed, not because the Jedi defeated them alone, but because the Sith themselves had turned against one another. Ambition had consumed them. Ruin believed he could guide that ambition. He had hoped that by allowing many Sith to exist within a single brotherhood, the Order could grow strong enough to dominate the galaxy without destroying itself. For a time, that belief seemed possible. But the war against the Republic had created something Ruin could no longer fully control. The Sith had grown too numerous. Across the Outer Rim and beyond, dozens of Dark Lords now commanded their own followers. Each one had been shaped by the same philosophy that Ruin himself had taught them, the belief that the Force existed to serve their will. Some of these Sith still respected Ruin as their founder. They remembered that without his teachings, the Sith would never have risen again. But others had begun to see him differently, not as the master of the Order, as an obstacle. Among the Sith, respect rarely remained permanent. Strength determined leadership. And as the war continued, some Dark Lords began to believe their own strength might surpass the man who had created the Brotherhood itself. These thoughts did not appear suddenly. They grew slowly, whispered in private conversations among rival Sith factions. Ambitious lords began discussing the future of the Order once the war against the Republic was won. Some believed Ruin should remain the guiding figure of the Sith. Others believed the Order required a new leader, one whose vision was stronger, one whose power proved superior. The dark side encouraged such thinking. Each Sith Lord had been trained to trust their own ambition, to believe that the Force favored those with the strongest will. Over time, that belief made the existence of a single authority difficult to accept. Ruin could feel the change within the Force. The presence of the dark side around him had grown stronger over the years, but it had also become more chaotic. Rival Sith Lords moved through the Force like storms colliding across the galaxy. Some still served his command. Others followed their own path. And somewhere within that growing chaos, a dangerous truth was forming. Darth Ruin had created the Sith Brotherhood, but the philosophy he had used to build it no longer guaranteed his control over it. The dark side had given his followers strength. Now that same strength was beginning to turn against him. The Sith did not gather openly to discuss betrayal. Among followers of the dark side, trust had always been fragile. Every Sith Lord understood that the others around them were capable of deception, ambition, and violence. Conspiracies rarely required formal meetings. They grew in silence. Across distant systems controlled by the Sith, quiet conversations began taking place between rival Dark Lords. Some of these discussions happened during military campaigns. Others occurred in secret chambers within conquered worlds, far from the eyes of the Republic or the Jedi. The topic was rarely spoken directly, but the meaning was clear. Darth Ruin had created the Brotherhood, yet many began to question whether he still deserved to rule it. The Sith philosophy itself encouraged such thinking. Each lord had been taught that the Force responded to strength. Authority was not inherited or granted by tradition. It was taken. Some of Ruin's earliest disciples had once believed their master would always remain the most powerful among them. But years of war had changed the balance of power within the Brotherhood. New Sith had risen who possessed incredible strength in the dark side. Some commanded vast armies of followers. Others had conquered entire systems through cunning and manipulation. Each victory fed their ambition. Each success whispered the same question. If they possessed greater power, why should Ruin remain their leader? At first, these doubts remained isolated. One Sith Lord might secretly wonder whether they could surpass the founder of the Order. Another might quietly resent the authority Ruin still held over the Brotherhood. But as the war continued, these thoughts began connecting. Rival Sith factions discovered that they shared the same frustration. They had grown powerful enough to shape the galaxy itself, yet they still lived under the shadow of the man who had first brought them together. Eventually, a dangerous idea began spreading among them. Perhaps the Sith Brotherhood no longer needed its founder. This idea did not unite them in loyalty to one another. Instead, it created something more volatile, temporary alliances. Some Sith began forming quiet agreements with their rivals. They spoke carefully, always aware that betrayal could come at any moment. But for a brief time, their interests aligned. If Darth Ruin fell, the Order would fracture, and in that chaos, the strongest among them could claim leadership. These conspiracies moved through the Brotherhood like shadows. No single Sith planned the rebellion alone. Instead, dozens of Dark Lords carried the same thought within their minds. The founder had grown old, the war had changed the galaxy, and the Sith were no longer a small order that required guidance. They were an army of monsters created by Ruin himself, and monsters rarely remained loyal forever. Darth Ruin sensed the shift within the Force. The dark side around him had become restless, filled with the ambitions of the Sith, who now rivaled one another across the galaxy. He could feel their rivalries, their hunger for greater power, and the quiet calculations forming inside their thoughts. He understood what was coming. The Sith had always believed that strength determined survival. Now they were preparing to test that belief against the man who had taught it to them. Somewhere within the Brotherhood, the moment had already begun approaching. The moment when the Sith would decide whether their founder still deserved to stand above them, or whether he would become the next obstacle they needed to destroy. Darth Ruin did not learn about the betrayal through spies. He felt it through the Force. For many years, the dark side had been a source of strength for him. It surrounded the Sith Brotherhood, like a storm that stretched across the galaxy. Each Dark Lord he had trained carried a presence within that storm, their ambitions and emotions flowing through the Force like currents in a violent sea. Ruin had grown used to that chaos. But now the currents had changed. The ambition of the Sith was no longer directed outward toward the Republic and the Jedi. It had begun turning inward. The Force carried whispers of conflict between the Dark Lords. Rivalries had always existed within the Brotherhood, but now those rivalries had sharpened into something more deliberate. Plans, calculations, the quiet preparation for a single moment that many of Ruin's followers now believed was inevitable, the overthrow of their founder. Ruin understood the logic behind it. He had built the Sith Brotherhood on a philosophy that rejected obedience. The Sith did not believe in loyalty for its own sake. They believed in strength. If a Sith proved stronger than their master, then the master deserved to fall. For years, that belief had helped the Order grow. Now, it threatened to destroy the man who created it. The first open sign of rebellion appeared during a gathering of several Sith Lords on a conquered Outer Rim world. These meetings were rare, but the war against the Republic sometimes forced powerful Sith commanders to coordinate their strategies. At least, that had been the purpose of the meeting. But the moment Ruin arrived, the atmosphere felt different. The force around the chamber was heavy with tension. Several Dark Lords stood silently as Ruin entered, their expressions calm, but their presence within the force burning with restrained aggression. They were no longer merely his followers. They were rivals. For a brief moment, nothing happened. The Sith understood that betrayal required careful timing. If one of them attacked too soon, the others might turn against them instead. But eventually, the tension reached its breaking point. One of the Dark Lords stepped forward. Their voice was calm as they spoke, yet the challenge within their words was unmistakable. The Sith had grown beyond the need for a single founder. The galaxy was changing. The Brotherhood required a leader whose strength matched the new age of war. And if Ruin believed himself worthy of that position, he should prove it. The meaning was clear. The Sith were invoking the oldest tradition of the dark side. Power would decide leadership. For a moment, Ruin said nothing. He studied the figures standing before him, sensing the same ambition burning within each of them. The rebellion was no longer hidden. The conspiracies he had felt through the Force had now become open defiance. This was the outcome the Sith philosophy always created. Strength against strength. The strong surviving, the weak falling. Slowly, Ruin ignited his lightsaber. The red blade illuminated the chamber in sharp crimson light. He did not protest. He did not attempt to reason with them, because he understood the truth of the moment. The Sith had never been meant to remain united forever. And now, the Brotherhood he created had come to test its founder. What followed was not a duel. It was a storm of red blades and dark side power unleashed within a single chamber. And at the center of that storm stood the man who had brought the Sith back to life. The chamber became a storm of crimson light. Multiple lightsabers ignited at once, their red blades casting violent reflections across the dark stone walls. The air itself seemed to tremble as waves of dark side energy collided in every direction. Darth Ruin stood at the center of it all. For years he had been the founder, the teacher, the Dark Lord who rebuilt the Sith from extinction. Now he was simply another warrior, surrounded by enemies who carried the same power he had once taught them to use. The Sith did not attack him with hesitation. Ambition had already erased that weakness. Several Dark Lords moved at once, their strikes fast and brutal. Blades clashed against Ruin's saber as the chamber erupted into chaos. Force energy surged through the room, throwing shattered fragments of stone into the air as the Sith unleashed the full strength of the dark side against one another. But Ruin had not survived this long by being weak. For a time, he fought like the master he had once been within the Jedi Order. His movements were precise and controlled, the discipline of his earlier training blending with the ferocity of the dark side. One Sith Lord was thrown violently across the chamber by a burst of force power. Another fell when Ruin's blade cut through their guard. Even surrounded, he was still dangerous, but numbers slowly shifted the balance. The Sith who had turned against him were many, and each one carried the same hunger for power that Ruin himself had once embraced. They did not fight with loyalty to one another. Each hoped to be the one who struck the final blow. The chamber filled with the sound of clashing sabers and violent bursts of dark side energy. Eventually, even Ruin's strength began to fade. The war he had unleashed had consumed years of his life. The brotherhood he created had grown far larger than any single Sith could control, and now the ambition he had nurtured inside his followers had finally turned against him. A single moment changed everything. One of the Dark Lords struck from behind, their blade cutting through Ruin's defense as another Sith attacked from the front. The founder of the Brotherhood staggered, his concentration breaking for just long enough to give his enemies the opening they needed. More blades followed. The storm of attacks closed around him. When the violence finally ended, Darth Ruin lay motionless upon the stone floor of the chamber. The Sith who had once followed him stood silently around the body. No one spoke. There was no ceremony. Among the Sith, the death of a master was not mourned. It was accepted. Ruin had created the brotherhood that resurrected the Sith. He had unleashed a war that would stretch across the galaxy for centuries. Without him, the Sith might have remained nothing more than forgotten legends. But the philosophy he used to build the Order had always carried the same conclusion. The strong rule, the weak fall. Now the founder himself had become part of that lesson. The Sith who stood inside the ruined chamber did not see his death as the end of the Order. They saw it as proof that the dark side had chosen its next leaders. Darth Ruin had brought the Sith back to life. But in the end, the Sith had consumed their creator. And the war he began was far from over. When Darth Ruin died, the war did not end. For a brief moment, some within the Republic believed it might. The Jedi had learned that the founder of the Sith Brotherhood had been killed by his own followers. History had shown many times that when a Dark Lord fell, the forces they commanded often collapsed soon after. But this time, the opposite happened. The Sith did not disappear. They multiplied. Without Ruin standing above them, the brotherhood he had created shattered into dozens of rival factions. Each Sith Lord now believed the future of the dark side belonged to them. Some declared themselves the rightful successor to Ruin. Others rejected the idea of a single leader entirely, believing the Sith should rule through strength alone. Instead of one order, the galaxy now faced many. Each faction commanded its own armies. Each Sith Lord gathered disciples and warriors who believed in their vision of the dark side. Entire sectors of space became battlegrounds, where Sith fought not only the Republic, but each other. And through it all, the Jedi Order stood between them and the rest of the galaxy. The Republic soon realized something terrifying. The death of Darth Ruin had not ended the war. It had only begun it. Republic worlds that once believed themselves safe found Sith fleets appearing above their skies. Jedi Knights were sent to defend planets across the Outer Rim. But the Sith rarely attacked in predictable ways. Some struck through open battle. Others infiltrated governments, turning entire systems to the dark side from within. Every time the Jedi defeated one Sith faction, another seemed to rise somewhere else. The conflict spread through generation after generation. Children born during the early years of the war grew old without ever knowing peace. Republic soldiers trained their entire lives expecting to fight Sith forces. Jedi younglings entered the temple, already aware that their future would almost certainly include battle. The galaxy had entered a new age, an age where war between Jedi and Sith no longer appeared temporary. It had become the background of existence itself. Historians of the Republic would later give this era a name: the New Sith Wars. But the people living through those centuries did not think of it as history. To them, it was simply life. Life in a galaxy where the dark side had returned in numbers too great to destroy easily. A galaxy where the legacy of one fallen Jedi Master continued shaping the fate of trillions of lives. Darth Ruin had died, but the storm he unleashed was still spreading across the stars. At first, the Republic believed the Sith factions would destroy each other. That belief seemed reasonable. The dark side had always created rivalry among its followers, and the Sith were now divided into dozens of competing groups. Each faction fought for territory, resources, and control of conquered systems. From a distance, it looked like chaos, but chaos did not weaken the Sith. It made them harder to defeat. Each time one Sith Lord fell, another rose to take their place. When one faction collapsed, its surviving warriors often joined another dark side master. The Sith did not vanish when they lost battles. They scattered, like embers carried by the wind. Soon, the Republic realized something deeply unsettling. The Sith had become impossible to eliminate through a single victory. Some Sith ruled entire star systems, commanding fleets that rivaled those of the Republic itself. Others operated in secrecy, hiding among the outer rim worlds while gathering followers in the shadows. Dark side cults appeared on planets that had never before known the presence of Sith teachings. Even worlds protected by the Republic began feeling the influence of the dark side. Some planetary leaders secretly aligned themselves with Sith Lords who promised power and independence from Coruscant. Others were manipulated through fear, blackmail, or the subtle influence of the Force. The Sith had become something far more dangerous than a traditional enemy. They had become a plague, a presence that spread across the galaxy faster than the Republic could contain it. The Jedi Order tried to respond as best it could. Knights and masters were dispatched to troubled systems across the Republic. Some fought openly alongside Republic forces. Others worked quietly, investigating rumors of Sith activity before it could grow into open rebellion. But the Jedi were few, the galaxy was vast, and the Sith no longer followed a single leader whose defeat might end the war. Instead, every Sith Lord carried the same belief, that the galaxy belonged to the strong. Each one believed they would eventually become the master who ruled the dark side itself. For centuries, that belief drove them forward. The Republic Senate slowly transformed into a government that existed almost entirely to support the war effort. Entire fleets were constructed solely to defend worlds threatened by Sith invasion. Generations of Republic citizens grew up seeing Jedi as warriors rather than peaceful guardians. Peace became a distant memory. And as the years passed, even the Jedi began to change. Because a war that lasts for generations does something to everyone who fights in it, even those who serve the light. For centuries, the Jedi had believed their purpose was clear. They were guardians of peace, protectors of the Republic. Their training had always focused on balance, patience, and understanding the will of the Force. Jedi Knights were taught that violence was a last resort, something used only when no other path remained. But the new Sith Wars changed that. The galaxy no longer faced isolated threats that could be resolved through diplomacy or small conflicts. Entire sectors had fallen under the influence of Sith factions. Republic worlds were attacked repeatedly by enemies who possessed the same mastery of the Force as the Jedi themselves. The Order could not remain distant from the war. It had to fight. Jedi Knights, who once served as mediators and diplomats, were now leading Republic armies into battle. Lightsabers ignited not only in defense of the innocent, but on open battlefields where thousands of soldiers fought and died around them. The Jedi Order slowly transformed. New generations of Jedi grew up knowing the Sith not as ancient enemies from distant history, but as the greatest threat to the galaxy. Training inside the temple began preparing young Jedi for combat far earlier than in previous centuries. Even the philosophy of the Order began to shift. Some Jedi Masters feared the Long War was pulling the Order too close to the same violence that defined the Sith. Others believed the Jedi had no choice. If they did not stand against the dark side, the Republic itself might collapse. Every year the war continued seemed to confirm that fear. Entire star systems were devastated by Sith invasions. Republic fleets were forced into constant battle across the Outer Rim. Even within the core worlds, rumors spread of Sith agents manipulating events from the shadows. The Jedi fought wherever the darkness appeared. Sometimes they won. Other times they did not. The Sith were powerful, unpredictable, and numerous. Some were brilliant strategists who commanded massive fleets. Others preferred assassination and deception, striking the Republic from within before vanishing into the shadows once more. Victory in one region rarely brought peace for long. Another Sith Lord would appear somewhere else. The war simply moved. Generations of Jedi Knights lived and died during these centuries of conflict. Some became legendary defenders of the Republic. Others fell in battle against the Sith. Their stories remembered only inside the archives of the Jedi Temple. The Order endured, but the war left its mark. Because when peacekeepers spend centuries fighting war after war, even they begin to forget what peace truly feels like. As the centuries passed, the galaxy slowly adapted to the war. Entire generations of Republic citizens were born into a reality where the conflict between Jedi and Sith never truly ended. Children grew up hearing stories of distant worlds destroyed by Sith fleets. Merchants planned their trade routes carefully, always aware that certain regions of space had become too dangerous to travel. Peace still existed in some places, but it was fragile. The Republic struggled to maintain stability across its enormous territory. Every few years, new Sith factions appeared somewhere along the edges of known space. Some rose quickly, conquering several systems before the Jedi could respond. Others operated quietly, building influence over decades before revealing themselves. The Sith had become a permanent shadow across the galaxy. Republic fleets grew larger as the war continued. Entire shipyards were dedicated to building vessels meant only for battle. Military academies trained officers whose entire careers would be spent fighting Sith forces. The Republic had become a civilization at war. Even the Jedi Order, which once stood apart from the politics of the Senate, now found itself deeply tied to the survival of the Republic itself. Jedi Masters advised military commanders. Jedi Knights led soldiers into battle on worlds where the dark side had taken root. The line between guardian and warrior had grown thin. Some Jedi began wondering if the war itself was slowly changing the Order. Centuries of combat placed enormous pressure on their ideals. The dark side thrived on conflict, and the Sith seemed willing to fight forever. Yet the Jedi endured. They believed the light side of the Force would eventually restore balance. Even if the war lasted generations, they trusted that the Sith could not dominate the galaxy forever. But the cost of that belief was enormous. Entire worlds had been scarred by the endless conflict. Cities rebuilt themselves only to face destruction again decades later. Families lived their entire lives knowing the war might one day reach their home system. Historians would later study this era with a sense of disbelief. Nearly 1,000 years of war between Jedi and Sith, a conflict so long that the galaxy itself began forgetting what life had been like before it. And at the center of that long nightmare was a single moment in history. The day a Jedi Master walked away from the Order and became Darth Ruin. He had died centuries earlier, but the war he unleashed still burned across the stars. For nearly 1,000 years, the war continued. The galaxy changed in countless ways during those centuries. Republic fleets rose and fell. Entire Jedi generations lived and died on distant battlefields. Sith factions appeared and vanished across the Outer Rim like violent storms that never fully disappeared. But one thing remained constant. The Sith never truly won. Despite their power, despite their numbers, and despite the fear they spread across the galaxy, the dark side remained trapped in the same cycle that had begun with Darth Ruin: ambition, rivalry, betrayal. The Brotherhood Ruin created had been powerful enough to start the new Sith Wars. Yet that same Brotherhood had always carried the seed of its own destruction. Every Sith believed they deserved power. Every Sith believed they could rule better than the others. And so the Sith fought. They fought the Jedi. They fought the Republic. And just as often, they fought each other. Entire Sith empires rose from the chaos of the war, only to collapse when their own leaders turned against one another. Powerful Dark Lords conquered vast territories, only to be betrayed by their apprentices or rivals. Sith academies trained thousands of followers, yet those followers rarely remained loyal for long. The dark side made them strong, but it also made them unstable. By the later centuries of the new Sith Wars, the Sith had become something very different from the Order Darth Ruin first created. Instead of a brotherhood united under a shared vision, the dark side had fractured into endless competing factions. Some Sith commanded fleets of warships, the others ruled small armies hidden on distant worlds. Some operated as warlords, conquering systems through brute strength. Others preferred manipulation, influencing planetary governments from the shadows. But none of them could truly control the others. The Sith had become an army that could not unite. The Jedi understood this weakness. For centuries, the Order had survived, not because it defeated every Sith Lord it encountered, but because the Sith continually destroyed their own alliances. When rival factions of dark side followers turned against each other, the Jedi used those moments to push the darkness back. Slowly, patiently. The war dragged on through generation after generation. Historians would later struggle to count how many Sith rose during those centuries. Some Dark Lords ruled for decades before falling. Others vanished after only a few years of conflict. But no Sith leader ever succeeded in fully uniting the Order. Not after Darth Ruin. His attempt to create a brotherhood of Sith had changed the galaxy forever, but it had also created a problem the Sith could never solve. Too many masters, too many ambitions, too many monsters competing for the same throne. By the final centuries of the new Sith Wars, the galaxy had grown tired of the endless conflict. Entire worlds had been scarred by war for generations. The Republic itself had nearly collapsed more than once under the pressure of fighting the dark side for so long. Yet the Sith still remained divided. And it was during this time that a young Sith warrior began studying the history of the Order. His name was Darth Bane. Unlike many of the other Sith, Bane was not impressed by the power of the Brotherhood. When he looked at the history of the new Sith Wars, he saw something different. He saw failure, 1,000 years of war, and still the Sith had not won. As he studied the past, Bane discovered the truth hidden inside the legacy of Darth Ruin. The Sith had not been defeated by the Jedi. They had been defeated by themselves, and if the Sith were ever going to survive, that truth would have to change. Darth Bane had grown up inside the chaos the Sith themselves had created. By the time he began his journey through the dark side, the new Sith Wars had already lasted for centuries. The Sith Brotherhood of Darkness ruled large portions of the galaxy, commanding vast armies that challenged the Republic and the Jedi at every turn. To many Sith, this seemed like a golden age. Thousands of Sith Lords and dark side warriors stood united against the Jedi Order. Entire academies trained followers in the teachings of the dark side. The Republic trembled whenever Sith fleets appeared above its worlds. But when Bane looked at the Brotherhood, he saw something very different. He saw weakness. The Brotherhood believed that equality among the Sith would prevent the betrayals that had destroyed the ancient empires. Instead of allowing Sith to compete openly for power, their leaders attempted to create a structure where all Sith Lords served the same cause. On the surface, this seemed like a solution to the problem Darth Ruin had created. But Bane understood something the others did not. The dark side did not reward equality. It rewarded dominance. If many Sith shared power equally, and then none of them could truly grow stronger than the others. Ambition would always remain trapped beneath rules meant to keep the Brotherhood united. To Bane, this was a betrayal of what it meant to be Sith. The dark side demanded strength, and strength required conflict. As Bane studied the history of the Sith, he began to see the same pattern repeating again and again. The ancient Sith empires had fallen because too many Dark Lords fought each other. The Brotherhood created by Darth Ruin had collapsed for the same reason, and now the Brotherhood of Darkness was attempting the opposite solution, suppressing ambition entirely. Both paths led to failure. The Sith had become trapped between chaos and weakness. Either they destroyed themselves through rivalry, or they weakened themselves by pretending rivalry did not exist. And Bane believed there was only one way to break the cycle. The Sith needed to change. He began studying the ancient teachings of the dark side, searching for answers buried inside forgotten holocrons and lost Sith texts. The deeper he looked into the history of the Sith, the more convinced he became that the Order had misunderstood its own nature. The dark side thrived on ambition, but ambition had to be controlled, not by peace, by structure. Bane began imagining a new version of the Sith, an order where ambition was not suppressed, but refined, where betrayal still existed, but served a greater purpose, where power would pass from one generation to the next, without allowing hundreds of Sith Lords to tear each other apart. The answer slowly formed inside his mind. The Sith did not need many masters. They needed only two. One to hold the power, and one to crave it. A master who embodied the strength of the dark side. An apprentice who desired that strength and would eventually challenge the master to claim it. Through this cycle, the Sith would grow stronger with every generation. No armies of rival Dark Lords. No brotherhoods collapsing under the weight of their own ambition. Only the strongest Sith surviving. Bane understood that creating such a future would require destroying the order that currently existed. The Brotherhood of Darkness still believed they could defeat the Jedi through numbers, but Bane had already seen the truth. Numbers had always been the Sith's greatest weakness. Darth Ruin had proven that centuries earlier. Now Bane would ensure the Sith never repeated that mistake again. By the time Darth Bane reached his final conclusion, the Sith already stood at the edge of collapse. The Brotherhood of Darkness had gathered thousands of dark side followers under one banner. Sith Lords commanded armies across the galaxy, fighting the Republic and the Jedi in what many believed would be the final phase of the new Sith Wars. But Bane could see what the others could not. The Brotherhood was repeating the same mistake that had destroyed the Sith before. Too many masters, too many ambitions, too many Sith sharing power that should never have been shared. Their leaders believed unity would save them. They believed that if the Sith stopped competing against one another, they could finally defeat the Jedi and rule the galaxy together. But to Bane, that idea was a lie. The Sith were not meant to be equals. The dark side demanded dominance, which, as long as hundreds of Sith existed at the same time, the Order would always weaken itself. Some Sith would be powerful, others would be mediocre. Some would hesitate to betray their rivals because of loyalty to the Brotherhood. To Bane, that hesitation was poison. The Sith had forgotten what they were meant to be. So he made a decision that would change the future of the dark side forever. If the Sith could not survive with many masters, then many masters would have to die. At the time, the Brotherhood of Darkness was preparing for a massive confrontation with the Jedi and the Republic on the world of Rusan. The battle was expected to determine the future of the war itself. Thousands of Sith gathered there alongside vast armies of soldiers loyal to the dark side. To the rest of the Brotherhood, this was the moment they would finally crush the Jedi. To Bane, it was something else. An opportunity. The Sith leaders had prepared a powerful weapon known as a thought bomb, a ritual of dark side energy capable of destroying every Force-sensitive being caught within its reach. They believed it could wipe out the Jedi armies gathered on Rusan in a single devastating moment. But Bane understood what the weapon truly meant. The thought bomb would not distinguish between Jedi and Sith. Anyone strong in the Force would be consumed. The Brotherhood believed they could control such power. Bane knew better. He left Rusan before the ritual was completed. As the battle reached its final moment, the Sith unleashed the thought bomb. Dark side energy erupted across the battlefield, consuming every Force-sensitive warrior trapped within the blast. Jedi and Sith alike vanished in an instant. Thousands of Sith Lords gone. The Brotherhood of Darkness had destroyed itself. The war that had lasted nearly 1,000 years ended in a single terrible moment of silence. And somewhere far from the battlefield, Darth Bane watched the future he had planned begin to take shape. The Sith were nearly extinct once again. But this time, that extinction was not a failure. It was a beginning. The galaxy believed the Sith were gone. When the final battle on Rusan ended, the Republic celebrated the victory as the conclusion of the new Sith Wars. The Jedi Order believed the Brotherhood of Darkness had destroyed itself with the terrible power of the thought bomb. Thousands of Sith had vanished in that single moment, and no dark side armies remained to challenge the Republic. For the first time in nearly 1,000 years, the galaxy felt something it had almost forgotten. Peace. The Republic rebuilt worlds scarred by centuries of conflict. Trade routes reopened across regions of space that had been battlefields for generations. The Jedi Order slowly returned to the role it had once held, long before the war began. Guardians of Peace. Historians believed the Sith had finally been erased from the galaxy, but history had misunderstood what truly happened on Rusan. The Sith had not disappeared. They had been reborn. Far from the battlefield, Darth Bane watched the aftermath of the war with calm certainty. The Brotherhood of Darkness was gone, just as he had intended. The thousands of Sith who once fought for control of the dark side had been consumed by their own weapon. The chaos that began with Darth Ruin had finally reached its conclusion. Too many Sith had always been the problem. Now that problem was gone. Bane understood that the Sith did not need armies or empires to survive. In fact, those things had always been their weakness. Large numbers of Sith created rivalry, betrayal, and endless internal conflict. But two Sith could survive. Two Sith could grow stronger with every generation. Bane began building a new future for the dark side. Single master, a single apprentice. The master would possess the knowledge and power of the Sith. The apprentice would crave that power and learn everything the master could teach. Eventually, the apprentice would challenge the master, proving their strength by replacing them. In that moment, the Sith would grow stronger, and the cycle would continue. One master to embody the power of the dark side, one apprentice to desire it, the rule of two. This rule solved the problem that had destroyed the Sith for thousands of years. There would never again be hundreds of Dark Lords competing for the same throne. There would never again be an empire that collapsed because too many Sith sought power at the same time. Instead, the Sith would become patient, hidden, each generation stronger than the last. The galaxy believed the Sith had vanished after the new Sith Wars, but the truth was far more dangerous. The Sith had learned from their mistakes. Darth Ruin had resurrected the Sith and unleashed a war that scarred the galaxy for nearly 1,000 years. His brotherhood proved that the dark side could return in numbers powerful enough to challenge the Jedi, but it also proved the greatest weakness of the Sith. Too many masters destroy each other. Darth Bane understood what Ruin never could. The Sith did not need an empire. They only needed time. From the shadows, the rule of two would guide the dark side for centuries to come. Master and apprentice would move quietly through the galaxy, gathering knowledge and waiting for the moment when the Sith could finally rise again. And one day, nearly 1,000 years later, that hidden legacy would produce a Sith Lord powerful enough to destroy the Jedi Order itself, a man named Darth Sidious. The galaxy would never forget his victory, but the path that led to that moment began long before him. It began with a Jedi Master who walked away from the Order and became Darth Ruin, the Sith who brought the darkness back to life.